Dorothy Rothschild was supposed to be born in New York City, but was born prematurely in West End, New Jersey, on August 22, 1893. Regarding her last name, Dorothy would later say, "My God, no, dear, we'd never heard of those Rothschilds." Nonetheless, West End in the 1890s was a fashionable town where Dorothy's family spent their summers with lawn tennis, sailing, and concerts. Her father, Henry, and mother, Eliza Marston, grew up in the same building, a two-family dwelling at 124 West 27th Street. Eliza's father was a machinist at their family's armory. Eliza's parents, of Irish origin, did not want Eliza to marry a German Jew, so they moved. But it only prolonged the inevitable. Henry and Eliza finally married when Eliza was almost 30 years old in the summer of 1880. Henry was a cloak manufacturer, Eliza a teacher, before giving birth to 4 children: Harold, Bertram, Helen, and Dorothy. Dorothy later attributed her estrangement from her siblings due to the age gap. Helen was 6 years older, Harold 12. In the siblings' defense, Dorothy also disliked the whole Rothschild tribe. What may have been healthy merriment, she perceived as absurd, wisecracking horseplay. Little girls at this time wore middies and brown stockings. Little boys, sailor suits. There was no electricity in the Rothschilds' house. Summers were spent in West End. Harry and Bert would dare the girls to hold ice cream under their tongues until they shrieked. Dorothy's world was striped into bands of pale blue sky, crystal water, and sand the color of straw. A world soon shattered. When Dorothy was 5 years old, her mother, Eliza, died suddenly of an artery disease during a thunderstorm. Dorothy screamed her head off. None of her characters in her short stories were to be loving mothers. Her father, Henry, remarried a retired teacher, Eleanor Frances Lewis, who Dorothy called Mrs. Rothschild, which hurt Eleanor's feelings. Henry tried to make up for it by pampering Eleanor. All the children were indifferent, though Dorothy especially hated her. The family would make visits to Eliza's grave at Woodlawn, where Henry would start bawling. "We're all here, Eliza. I'm here. Dorothy's here. Mrs. Rothschild is here." Dorothy would smile inwardly and imagine her deceased mother laughing at all these silly things being said. For schooling, Dorothy and Helen attended Blessed Sacrament Academy. Helen adapted, but Dorothy did not. She befriended a girl named Mercedes, a victim of teasing because Mercedes' parents were going through divorce. Dorothy stood up for her, and the two girls were branded as troublemakers. At home, Dorothy would give Eleanor sulphurous stares and extended silences, and there must have been times when Eleanor wanted to strangle her. Dorothy wished Eleanor was dead, and in 1903, she got her wish. Eleanor fell dead of an acute cerebral hemorrhage. The early trauma of Eliza and Eleanor's deaths affected Dorothy deeply. She felt guilt, self-pity, self-hatred, and deserving of punishment. Henry switched occupation from cloaks to cigars and moved his family into a brownstone on Riverside Drive with 2 maids, 3 dogs, and no remarriage. Dorothy spent her time collecting photos of Maude Adams. She once sent the actress a letter that began, "Dearest Peter," and received one of the much-coveted thimbles inscribed, "A kiss from Peter Pan." Before long, Dorothy's siblings were almost adults. Bert became engaged to a long-legged colt of a girl named Meade, and Helen fell in love with George Drost, Jr., the scion of a well-known baking company. Dorothy admired Helen's popularity and good looks, a model of ideal womanhood that Dorothy wanted to copy, though secretly feared it was a useless endeavor. She was the artist of the family. On the verge of adolescence, she felt there was something wrong with her, and so she created a new Dorothy she liked better. This Dorothy she modeled on Becky Sharp, a character in William Thackeray's novel Vanity Fair. Sharp was female insubordination personified. At age 30, Dorothy wrote, the only thing she could count on having until she died was laughter, hope, and a sock in the eye. Dorothy's negativity extended toward her father, but her view of him was at odds with his generous, jolly nature. They even shared a knack for writing poetry. They would exchange verse in their letters. "Dear Papa, this morning I received your poem. How did you do it? All alone. When you come down on Sunday, Pa? No, nothing rhymes except cigar. Well, I must tell you anyway. Bring down St. Nicholas next Sunday. This poem looks kinder good to me. With love to Rags, from Dorothy." At 14, Dorothy was enrolled at Miss Dana's boarding school. Her best marks were in Bible study and piano, her worst in gym. She received A's in deportment. For unexplained reasons, she did not return the following year, and in 1908 her education stopped. Her brother, Harry, disowned the family and left. Bert was married, and Helen soon to be wed, leaving Dorothy and her father alone in the house. They moved from Riverside Drive to Amsterdam Avenue, then to an undistinguished building on West 80th Street. By age 20, this arrangement of father and daughter was deadening. Dorothy found she'd become a caretaker to Henry while simultaneously dependent on him. During these coming-of-age years, many of Dorothy's aunts and uncles passed away, including her Uncle Martin. In 1912, Uncle Martin and Aunt Lizzie had left Southampton for New York aboard the Titanic. Aunt Lizzie arrived on the Carpathia, but no Martin. His death impacted Dorothy's life greatly, as it sparked a period of decline in her father. On Christmas Eve of 1913, instead of driving to the Lower East Side to hand out his annual donations to the police force, Henry lacked the energy and stayed home. A doctor was sent for. 3 days later, he was dead of a heart attack at age 62. The home was sold and possessions dispersed. Dorothy moved in with Helen or Bert and got a job at a dance school while writing light verse and submitting them to the New York Tribune and the Saturday Evening Post, to which she received lots of rejections. When it came to light verse, she thought it didn't qualify as actual writing, since anybody like her father could do it. She just wrote for fun. She incorporated colloquial fragments she'd heard on the street into her poems and submitted the latest to the new Condé Nast magazine, Vanity Fair. Editor Frank Crowninshield responded with an acceptance letter and $12. Emboldened by this, Dorothy walked into Crownenshield's office for a position. He said there was none available, but a few weeks later, Crowny, as she called him, told her there was a job at Vogue at a salary of $10 a week if she wanted it. She did. She took the job and moved into a boarding house at 103rd Street and Broadway that cost $8 a week. At Vogue, she captioned photographs of women in the latest styles, such as turning in copy that read, "There was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she wore this divine nightdress of rose-colored mousseline de soie, trimmed with frothy Valencian lace." This particular caption was later cut by the proofers for being subversive. While at Vogue, Dorothy would submit free verse to Crowny at Vanity Fair, whose offices were located on the same floor, some of which Crowny accepted. Typically, the subjects of these poems were complaints about not finding a man. In the summer of 1916, at a hotel in Branford, Connecticut, she found one. Edwin Pond Parker II, a stockbroker. His family came from a long line of Protestant clergymen, which molded Edwin as an atheist. He was cocky, spontaneous, and an alcoholic. Dorothy called him Eddie. As a love-starved and insecure woman, Dorothy overlooked his defects because she viewed him as superior and was too focused on her own shortcomings. She felt no connection with Judaism, but feared her background would be frowned upon by Eddie's reverend grandfather, and she was right. When she met the grandfather, he referred to her as a stranger within our gates and said, "O Lord, grant to the unbeliever in our midst the light to see the error of her ways." But this did not deter Eddie. The couple was married in June 1917 in Yonkers. Soon afterward, he joined the 33rd Ambulance Corps and departed for Summit, New Jersey for World War I. The experience disoriented Dorothy, who said she'd been married for about 5 minutes. During Eddie's absence, Dorothy had been training herself to write the Frank Crowninshield genre for Vanity Fair. Any subject was fair game so long as it was dressed up in evening clothes. A report on the Russian Revolution, for example, required mentions of debutante dinners, Grolier bindings, and French literature. Vanity Fair was a playpen where writers played games and goofed off. Crowny arranged her transfer from Vogue and made her the new drama critic to replace P.G. Wodehouse, who left to write a musical. Dorothy watched plays and reviewed them. About one play she wrote, "That was an excellent place to do knitting, and if you don't knit, bring a book." About another play, she refused to mention the author or cast so that she wouldn't have to tell on them. At another, instead of reviewing the performance, she reviewed the lady sitting next to her searching for a lost glove. Married life was turning out to be dull as mud. Before Eddie had left for the military, he and Dorothy had moved to West 71st Street, directly behind the brownstone where her family had once lived, serving as a reminder of the past. Presently, she had no clue how to be a good homemaker. Things weren't much better for Eddie. He drank all the time during training and witnessed the horrors of war during the Soissons offensive. Alcohol wasn't readily available at the front, so he switched to painkillers. After the war, he was reassigned to occupy Germany. Dorothy kept herself busy with hijinks at work. One of the editors, Albert Lee, had hung a detailed map of France above his desk with flags indicating the exact positions of the American army. His daily ritual was to check the morning papers and shift the locations of the flags. One day, Dorothy arrived early and rearranged all the flags to show the Kaiser winning. Lee blamed German spies and spent all morning correcting the map. Soon, Crowney hired a new managing editor, Robert Benchley. When Dorothy arrived one morning, she found Benchley sharing her office. He looked to be a prudish, domesticated 29-year-old Boy Scout. Just as she was getting used to him, Crowney hired a third desk in the room, Robert Sherwood, a 23-year-old veteran who'd served in the Canadian Black Watch and had been gassed and wounded. Sherwood had made Dorothy and Benchley so uncomfortable that they began having lunch together to discuss what to do. One day, when Dorothy and Benchley were leaving, Sherwood asked if he could come with them. Sherwood was 6'7" tall and needed protection from the midgets that congregated outside of the hippodrome. He was afraid of them teasing him for his height. He walked between Dorothy and Benchley, but it was no use. The midgets swarmed him and told him to duck when he passed under the 6th Avenue L. After that incident, Dorothy and Benchley had a change of heart and accepted Sherwood into their friendship. In spite of their approval, Benchley was shocked when Sherwood came to work with a hangover. Dorothy leapt to Sherwood's defense, saying that she attended cocktail parties too sometimes. More office hijinks followed, like when Dorothy cut out photos of cadavers and plastered them above her desk, or when Benchley showed up late and wrote a slip to explain his tardiness, that the hippodrome elephants had gotten loose and he had to herd them home. Soon, Dorothy received an invitation to attend a luncheon at the Algonquin Hotel. It was a party hosted by theatrical press agents to welcome Alexander Woolcott, the New York Times drama critic, back from the war. Woolcott was an abrasive character, a New Jersey Nero who was afraid of sex, wore opera capes, indulged in food, and was one of the worst writers in America, according to friends. He was an acquired taste, to be sure. 35 guests showed up to roast him, the most important being journalist Franklin Pierce Adams, who had a column in the New York Tribune called The Conning Tower. Adams would frequently parody The Diary of Samuel Pepys, pretending to be an Elizabethan snob. There was also Harold Ross, editor of The Home Sector, a magazine for veterans. Then there was the hypochondriac Haywood Broun, who worked at the New York Tribune with his feminist wife, Ruth Hale. Dorothy remained shy and could not decide if she liked them. One reason was because Woolcott was a driver in the war and was not on the front lines. Alec Woolcott's stories all began with, "When I was in the theater of war," until Arthur Samuels cut him short. "Alec, if you were ever in the theater of war, it was in the last row seat nearest the exit." As the luncheon drew to a close, somebody said, "Why don't we do this every day?" But nobody, least of all Dorothy, expected that to happen. Sure enough, on occasion, she and Benchley went there for lunch and came to call it the Gonk for short. Many guests at Woolcott's party had been dropped because he found them boring, but newcomers had been added, like newspaper reporters Mark Connolly and George Kaufman. Connolly evoked the behavior of a talkative leprechaun and aspired to be a playwright. Kaufman was a shy, nervous man, afraid of human contact, and was also Wolcott's assistant. Frank Case, the hotel manager, automatically began reserving a table for Wolcott and his friends. Case knew they were poor, so he would instruct the waiter to place complimentary popovers, celery, and olives on the table. Gossip, jeers, and jibes circled round, sometimes directed at the libidinous Condé Nast. When Eddie Parker returned home from the war, he was subdued, restless, and addicted to morphine. Crowninshield soon informed Dorothy that P.G. Woodhouse was returning to Vanity Fair and fired her. That was the official reason. Unofficially, she had offended Flo Ziegfeld's wife, Billie Burke, in a review, comparing her to an exotic dancer, and Ziegfeld made a phone call to Nast. Robert Sherwood was fired next, replaced by the woman who gave Nast's daughter music lessons. In a show of solidarity, Benchley just quit. Benchley, who was not so replaceable and had a wife and 2 children to support, stunned Crowninshield. After a lunch at the Gonk, Wolcott got a story in the New York Times announcing Dorothy's dismissal. Frank Adams followed up in the conning tower. R. Benchley tells me he hath resigned his position with Vanity Fair because they had discharged Dorothy Parker. Dorothy started freelance work writing title cards for D.W. Griffith's film Remodeling Her Husband, starring Dorothy Gish, while Edmund Bunny Wilson replaced Benchley at Vanity Fair without the title of managing editor or salary. Benchley and Dorothy rented an office together, eliciting jealousy from Benchley's wife. However, theirs was a platonic friendship based partly on the mutual interest of writing. For their next job, Dorothy became drama critic for a magazine called Ainsley's, where she could be as coarse as she liked. She also wrote a long piece for the Saturday Evening Post about the Ouija board craze, and lunch was always at the Gonk. The hotel's main restaurant was the Rose Room, where it was not unusual to catch sight of theatrical celebrities like John Barrymore and Douglas Fairbanks. No one paid the writers much attention, which meant they were undisturbed at a long table in the pergola room. Manager Frank Case still viewed them as overgrown children, aside from Franklin Pierce Adams, who commanded the largest salary. Despite Case's indifference, he noticed the group was getting larger by the week. He moved them to a front table in the Rose Room that held 16 chairs, putting Wolcott center stage. A cartoonist for the Brooklyn Eagle, Edmund Duffy, did a caricature of the group and labeled it the Algonquin Round Table. The name stuck, and newspaper columnists were hungry to publish quips that originated from these lunches. Frank Case was pleased with their popularity because it increased the restaurant's business. He was also pleased that he could stop serving rolls and celery. Throughout the 1920s, the group added to their list of core members Frank Sullivan, Charles MacArthur, Herman Mankiewicz, Harpo Marx, Donald Ogden Stewart, Murdoch Pemberton, Deems Taylor, and a latecomer to the group, novelist Edna Ferber, whose titles include Showboat, Cimarron, and So Big. Edna could spar with the best of them. One day she wore a double-breasted suit like Noel Coward. "You look almost like a man," remarked Coward. "So do you," Edna replied. Ring Lardner was another writer who lunched with them, a sports writer and humorist who covered baseball for the Chicago Tribune. He was an alcoholic and highly paid writer that bought a house in Great Neck, where he lived with his wife and 4 sons. Ring had mixed feelings toward the Round Tablers and functioned as a presiding but invisible deity who silently scorned them. Less well-known today was the youngest member of the Round Table, Broadway actress Margalot Gilmore, who died in 1986. Eddie Parker traded morphine for booze and got back to work on Wall Street. To fix their broken marriage, he and Dorothy tried the geography cure and moved midtown to 57 West 57th. The noise of the passing L was symbolic of their relationship's demise. While it deteriorated, Dorothy found a friend in illustrator Nisa McMean across the hall. Nisa played hostess to the Round Table in her apartment, as well as inviting Broadway and Tin Pan Alley. On a typical day, Dorothy might find Charlie Chaplin, Paul Robeson, or George Gershwin over. Liquor flowed freely. Nisa had installed a still in the bathroom. Out of the assorted emotional disorders among the Round Tablers, who were by this point conjoined at the hip, Nisa was the least neurotic. Anita Luce, author of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, thought Nisa was phony and that Dorothy was a lone wolverine who had no belief in friendship. A fair assessment, as Dorothy's barbs were sharp, nasty, and vengeful. Hearing that a friend had hurt her leg while visiting London, Dorothy said, "The woman had injured herself while sliding down a banister." When asked to use the word horticulture in a sentence, she replied, "You may lead a horticulture, but you can't make her think." Dorothy was developing a bad habit of flattering people to their faces and then condemning them behind their backs. "Did you ever meet such a shit?" she would say. More serious was that she shared Eddie's private life with the Round Table. Eddie's drunken misadventures were on full display. Upon paying respects at a funeral parlor to a friend who died, he accidentally brushed a knob that sent the casket into the flames of the crematorium and ran with Dorothy before anyone noticed. Eddie's drinking could rival Scott Fitzgerald's. In 1921, Robert Sherwood introduced Scott and Zelda to Dorothy. Dorothy had met Scott briefly in 1919 when he was working at an ad agency living in Morningside Heights and was in a torrid love affair with an English actress. Scott, Zelda, and Dorothy dined at the Algonquin, though not at the Round Table, but at a banquet. Dorothy described Scott and Zelda as looking robust with health, as though they had just stepped out of the sun. The Fitzgeralds lived around the corner from Eddie and Dorothy. She never knew how Scott got any work done. The place was a sty. Scott confided to her that he made $20,000 that year and was now broke. He asked to borrow $100. Dorothy obliged. Later, he told Dorothy that Zelda hid the money from him. In the early 1920s, Dorothy and Benchley discovered that drinking made one feel better. Benchley, who had scolded Dorothy for drinking in the past, was encouraged to try an orange blossom. Tony Soma's speakeasy became a regular haunt. Eddie encouraged Dorothy to drink more often, as it would keep her off his back about his own drinking. Her drink of choice was Scotch whiskey straight. In the spring of 1922, the Round Tablers produced a one-time musical, No Siree, an oddity that featured Deems Taylor as composer, Irving Berlin as conductor, Tallulah Bankhead as a chorus girl, and Dorothy contributing lyrics. In August, Dorothy turned 29. Eddie had gone back to Connecticut. Her achievements in life seemed trivial. She wanted to publish short fiction and so wrote the story, Such a Pretty Little Picture. The story is based on Robert Benchley, about a man with a picture-perfect house that secretly wants to leave his wife and daughter. Dorothy sold the story to The Smart Set, a nonconformist literary magazine co-edited by Henry Mencken and George Jean Nathan, which doted on realistic stories that spoke out against the ignorance and pretensions of the average American. Dorothy's writing process was masochistic. It took her 6 months to complete a story, laboring obsessively over each sentence to the point of inertia. But she had time for writing and self-reflection. With Eddie gone, the apartment empty, this was the perfect opportunity to heal herself. She did not. The chaos was too familiar, and she felt compelled to replace Eddie at once. Enter Charles Gordon MacArthur, a 27-year-old newspaperman. His mother died young, and his father was an evangelist who could smell a sinner 10 miles off on a windless day. The attraction between Charlie and Dorothy was immediate and intense, like a 2-ton truck meeting another 2-ton truck, said Mark Connolly. Dorothy and Charlie went to theater openings, Tony Soma's and Nisa McMean's, where Anita Luce appraised the romance. Dorothy's crush was ill-advised because Charlie struck Anita as a playboy, not to be pinned down by any one girl. When Dorothy saw Charlie with another woman, she burst into tears. "Lips that taste of tears," she wrote, "are the best for kissing." She became pregnant. Feeling guilty and lost, she opted for abortion. She grew tired and depressed, began sleeping all day until evening when she dressed to go out. Suicidal thoughts entered her mind. One January night, she telephoned the Swiss Alps restaurant, ordered a meal, and went into the bathroom where Eddie had left behind a discarded razor. When dinner arrived, she was slumped unconscious on the bathroom floor and rushed by ambulance to Presbyterian Hospital. When the Round Tablers visited her, she played the incident for laughs. It was just an unpredictable eccentricity, of course, seeing as she knew in advance the delivery man would arrive to find her. She did not get the help she needed. Things shifted in her life. Eddie moved back in. She gave up her office with Benchley, and she was turning in articles and light verse to the Saturday Evening Post. Gatsby-like parties were being thrown on the north shore of Long Island, an area nicknamed the Gold Coast. Herbert Swope, one of the foremost newspaper reporters of his generation, rented an old mansion overlooking the bay. He was cocksure and a compulsive talker and name-dropper. The Round Tablers held a high opinion of the man, mainly because he had employed most of them. His house at Great Neck was a summer playground for friends and gatecrashers. Seldom were formal invitations issued. People just showed up in their cars. Most of the guests knew little about him. Herbert and his wife organized treasure hunts that sent guests scurrying through the woods in search of sapphire cufflinks and other gewgaws. Ring Lardner watched the giant, continuous party from across a nearby field while sipping Canadian ale on his porch. The Swopes spent $1,000 a week on groceries. Dorothy made the place her usual weekend getaway and would settle on the veranda, imported scotch in hand. Once she was seated next to the governor of Maryland. When the governor's politics were interrupted by a drunk's noisy belch, Dorothy turned to the offender and said she would ask the governor to pardon him. There is drinking for fun, however, and there is drinking to deal with one's emotions. Robert Benchley believed that people ultimately become who they hate most. Dorothy found the idea repulsive. Be that as it may, Benchley proved his theory. He met a phone operator at the Biltmore and got her a job as a showgirl in a musical he was in. Thus began Benchley's double life. Eddie Parker moved back to Hartford once more, and Dorothy moved into the Algonquin. She became intimate with Elmer Rice, whom she was writing a play with, while her ex, Charlie, moved in with Benchley. Benchley was Dorothy's best friend. In order to spend time with Benchley, she had to see Charlie. Things were complicated, made worse by the play, Close Harmony. It got good reviews, but it closed after 24 shows. With more free time on her hands, in 1925, Dorothy had a series of affairs to give her the illusion of accomplishment and help obscure the fact Eddie Parker was long gone. Seward Collins, a Princeton grad and contributor to Vanity Fair, filled the role. He was a nice guy who loved Dorothy, but Dorothy didn't like nice guys. Collins wanted to marry and look after her, showering her with attention and presents, and even paid some of her bills. Collins had ambitions to buy a literary journal called The Bookman. Meanwhile, Harold Ross struck out with his wife, Jane Grant, and started The New Yorker. The first issue was a flop and did not include their fellow round-tablers, except for Dorothy, who wrote a drama review. Dorothy hated writing and would rather have cleaned out ferry boats, peddled fish, or become a Broadway chorus boy. She hated money but wanted it. She felt her celebrity was payment enough to stay at the Algonquin and sent Frank Case IOUs while somehow hiring a maid. The maid's name was Ivy. She usually served drinks and cleaned up after cocktail parties the next morning. When Collins wasn't chasing Dorothy, she was chasing Deems Taylor, but his reluctance to divorce or reciprocate the way she wanted sent her into a tailspin and inspired the poem Epitaph, which Ross published in The New Yorker. She tried to get away from it all at Ring Lardner's house in Great Neck, then to Ruth Hale's rat-infested farm, but there was no peace. Dorothy was in a low place. "What are you having?" asked the bartender. "Not much fun," said Dorothy. She came home one night intoxicated and ingested a bottle of Veronal. At the last moment before passing out, she hurled a glass through the window. After 2 days, she woke up in the hospital. Her new doctor, Dr. Barak, who mingled with the round-tablers, was not happy. While Dorothy was recovering, Haywood Broun would slip her his flask during visits. This also made Dr. Barak unhappy. He advised Dorothy to cut back on her drinking. The episode resulted in the poem Resume.
Razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful. You might as well live.
While Dorothy tried to get straightened out, she met Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was in New York to break his contract with Bonai and Liveright and sign with Scribner's. His reputation preceded him. Dorothy learned he was writing a semi-autobiographical novel, The Sun Also Rises, with Benchley and their friend Don Stewart as characters. She also found that she and Hemingway had the same writing process, both viewing the craft as grueling work. He enchanted her with his time in Paris and said he'd be returning in a week. On a whim, she decided to go with him. Why not? Maybe Paris would insulate her from bad habits and unsafe relationships. Benchley convinced his wife that he should go too. Dorothy, Benchley, and Hemingway drank scotch and champagne at a bon voyage party, and their ship left Hoboken during a blizzard. Dorothy felt apprehensive because of her Uncle Martin on the Titanic, but drinking helped. The three played bridge and ate together, where Hemingway made a serious production of consuming saltpeter. He told them it was necessary to control sexual appetites. Hemingway said that when they arrived, he would go immediately to Austria, where his wife, Hadley, and son, Bumby, were waiting for him, but upon arriving, he decided to linger in Paris. The reason for this change in plans was because his girlfriend, Pauline Pfeiffer, an editor for Vogue, was in town, which he kept secret from Dorothy. Dorothy, Benchley, and Hemingway hung out with Scott and Zelda in the Closerie des Lilas, and Hemingway suggested a trip to Spain. Seward Collins arrived, helped pay Dorothy's way, and together, minus the Fitzgeralds, traveled to Spain. Hemingway had mesmerized Dorothy with tales of the Spanish, but the romance was shattered at the bull ring when the bull stabbed a horse. She railed against the country later to Hemingway, and Hemingway privately added Dorothy's name to the list of people he disliked. In Paris, she wrote a slew of poems, among them a poem called News Item. Men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses. She also wrote 3 short stories for The New Yorker at this time, one of them titled, Oh, He's Charming. The story depicts a Tea Party encounter between a celebrity novelist and a female reader who is thrilled to meet him. The novelist has strong overtones of Ernest Hemingway, including the character's dismissal of Sherwood Anderson. Juxtaposed to Dorothy's feelings toward Hemingway, Hemingway attended a party where he roasted Dorothy in a poem for hating Spain. Then he went on to present several tragedies suffered by the Spanish people, whose courage he deeply appreciated. Dorothy was not present. She never learned of the incident and continued to admire Hemingway. While in Paris, Dorothy befriended Gerald and Sarah Murphy, a wealthy American couple with 3 young children who had an elegant house in Antibes called Villa America. After this, Dorothy returned to New York with her new Scotty dog and fell into routine. Smoky cocktail parties, ivy passing drinks, a few hours at a revolting play, and on to Tony Soma's. In December 1926, Boni and Liveright published her first collection of poems, Enough Rope, which became a bestseller, an unprecedented achievement for a volume of poetry. Suddenly, she was invited to literary luncheons held in hotel ballrooms filled with people who looked as if they had been scraped out of drains. Her publisher was about to advertise her as the next A. Milne, and Benchley ran around calling her Dotty the Pooh. She wanted to kill him. In 1927, she fell under the spell of communism and traveled to Boston to support the appeal of Sacco and Vanzetti. two anarchists found guilty of murdering a paymaster and guard in South Braintree, Massachusetts in 1920 and were sentenced to death. Dorothy was arrested in a protest after singing the communist anthem, the Internationale. Seward Collins showed up late and felt terrible because he'd missed the glory of being arrested. Dorothy, angered at the sight of him, said there was still time. It was not too late to go back to the State House and get himself arrested. Back in New York, Dorothy reviewed books for The New Yorker, and she let the authors have it. Crude is the name of Robert Hyde's first novel. It is also a criticism of it. Margot Asquith's latest book has all the depth and glitter of a worn dime. Confronted with a book about happiness by a Yale professor, Dorothy writes, second only to a rubber duck as the ideal bathtub companion. It may be held in the hand without causing muscular fatigue or nerve strain. It may be neatly balanced back of the faucets, and it may be read through before the water has cooled. And if it slips down the drain pipe, all right, it slips down the drain pipe. It's at this time Dorothy met John Garrett, another Wall Street man, of which they had nothing in common. But, transformed by alcohol, Garrett was fascinating. He pushed her buttons and had the bad habit of breaking his promises to telephone. One evening, Haywood Broun and Rebecca Bernstein were to dine with them. Broun and Rebecca plowed up the stairs to Garrett's apartment, only to find themselves with front-row seats to an argument between John, Dorothy, and a musical comedy actress. Dorothy was screaming graphic obscenities. "Let us leave," Broun whispered to Rebecca. He shut the door and crept away. Dorothy dedicated her next poetry collection to Garrett. The title was Sunset Gun. It sold well and was well received. At last, Dorothy left the Algonquin and moved to a furnished flat on East 54th Street, but was just as emotionally dependent on Garrett as ever. Dorothy experienced abdominal pain that winter and wondered if it might be appendicitis. Instead of telling Dr. Barak, she bought a book on appendicitis and self-diagnosed it as a fancy hangover, stating, "It was just the effects of that new scotch of mine, which, friends tell me, must have been specially made by the Borgias." In May, she was hospitalized for appendicitis. She gave her address as Bedpan Alley and demanded a typewriter to write her way out of the hospital bill. B. Stewart paid the tab, allowing Dorothy to convalesce at home in peace and boredom. Here, Dorothy wrote her longest story to date, Big Blonde. The story is a parable about a woman named Hazel Morse who loses her way and is condemned to live and wander. It's the most intensely autobiographical of all Dorothy's fiction. In February 1929, Big Blonde brought Dorothy unanimous praise and won the O. Henry Prize for that year. Benchley recently made a film called The Treasurer's Report for the William Fox Studio, which satirized the government response to the economy. A few months later, he acted in a second short, The Sex Life of the Polyp. Both endeavors changed Dorothy's opinion of film, and she moved to Culver City to work for MGM. Producer Irving Thalberg had no idea who she was, but she got an office at the end of the hall. It was a nice place, but the air was oppressive. Her desk smelled like an outhouse. After days of sniffing, she discovered the previous occupant had been growing mushrooms in a bottom drawer using liquid manure. After this was dealt with, she was tasked to write dialogue for a film, Madam X, and write a song for a film, Dynamite. Her time in Hollywood through, she soon found herself back in France at the Villa America, this time with Benchley and his family. Dorothy got some writing done, went swimming 2 kilometers a day, and played with the Murphy children. Scott and Zelda had returned too. Zelda was tired and remote. Scott, jittery and jealous of the attention Gerald and Sarah were heaping upon Dorothy. While at Villa America, Dorothy learned Garrett was also in France and asked him to come see her. Garrett cabled Dorothy, "Delighted, wire, always." Dorothy, feeling ignored, mourned the fantasy she had built with this man. Meanwhile, young Patrick Murphy was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and the Murphys dismantled Villa America and moved their whole establishment to Montana Vermala, a health resort near Sierra in the Swiss Alps. They asked Dorothy to come with them. She did, right after an interview with Hemingway to promote A Farewell to Arms. Hemingway would not permit her to write about his family in Oak Park, his divorce from Hadley, or anything he ever did or said, complained Dorothy. For Christmas, Hemingway and his new wife, Pauline, arrived at the Murphys with John Dos Passos and Passos' wife, Katie. The visit lifted Dorothy's spirits, for the place was getting glum. Hemingway shot a goose for dinner and roasted it in the hospital kitchen. Afterward, he taught the Murphy children how to ski. Dorothy viewed skiing with the same enthusiasm as she did an electric chair. The trip to the Alps was interspersed with returns to New York and 2 more suicide attempts. Under deadline to produce a novel for Viking Press, Dorothy had nothing, panicked, and drank a bottle of shoe polish. Viking scooped up her short stories and released them as a collection, Laments for the Living, to recoup the investment. The next attempt was with Barbiturates. Dorothy was in a stormy love affair with a young social climber, John McLean, and living back in the Algonquin. Depressed, she drafted a last will and testament for Benchley to find and ingested sleeping powders. In 1933, she turned 40, and with John McLean gone, it looked as if her sex life had ended. She had put sex carefully away on the highest cupboard shelf in a box marked Winter Hats, 1916. Then she met her future husband, Alan Campbell, at Tony Soma's one night. Alan was a 29-year-old actor from Virginia and had published in The New Yorker. His looks projected the image of a man clad in a blazer, carrying a racket, bursting through the doors of a drawing room and asking, "Tennis anyone?" His father was an alcoholic. His mother worked for the IRS as a clerk and devoted herself to making sure Alan received the very best life had to offer. Alan's parents divorced, and when Alan graduated Virginia Military Institute in civil engineering, he took off to New York to become an actor. When Alan and Dorothy got together, he said, "No one in the world has made me laugh as much as Dottie." Of course, the turn came, and one night at Tony Soma's, Alan stamped out angrily. Dorothy smiled at the patrons nearby. "I don't know why he should get so angry," she said, "just because I called him a fawn's ass." Dorothy's second short story collection came out, titled After Such Pleasures. Prohibition was repealed, and the couple traveled west to Denver for Alan's acting career. Rumors circulated among the press they were having an affair. Before Dorothy could stop him, Alan declared they were married. Alan fibbed about when and where. As the press searched for the record, Alan and Dorothy saved face and got married for real. They found a judge in New Mexico. It was the happiest summer of Dorothy's life. From Colorado, they ventured to Hollywood and signed with Paramount. Alan would receive $250 a week, Dorothy $1,000 for screenwriting. Alan blocked out scenes, and Dorothy filled them in with quippy dialogue. In addition to writing films, Alan also brought structure to Dorothy's life at home with their Bedlington Terriers on North Cannon Drive. After settling in, a year later, they moved into a mansion on North Roxbury Drive. Dorothy frequently saw fellow screenwriters Sid and Laura Perelman. They raved about a farm they had purchased in Pennsylvania, which gave Dorothy notions to buy one too, and so she did, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Alan invited his mother, Hortense, up to live with them. Dorothy hated her, so they moved her down the street. Things were looking up. The Campbell screenplay for A Star is Born was nominated for an Academy Award, and Dorothy was pregnant. But things soon changed. She was past the first trimester when she miscarried. In the past, her way to cope was self-destruction, but with Alan there to comfort her, she did her best to forget the incident. In 1937, they signed a 5-year contract with MGM for $5,200 a week. After a few misfires, Goldwyn put them on the picture You Can Be Beautiful. It was supposed to tell the story of a woman who revolutionized the beauty business. She had to be beautiful and happy. Dorothy suggested making the heroine plain as a pancake, a contented duckling who is transformed into an unhappy beauty. Goldwyn scolded Dorothy. "God damn it, Dorothy! You and your goddamn sophisticated jokes! You're a great writer. You're a great poet. Men never make a pass at girls wearing eyeglasses. That's a great poem, and you wrote it. You're a great wit. You're a great woman. But you haven't got a great audience, and you know why? Because you don't want to give people what they want." Dorothy's innocent face looked up at him. "But, Mr. Goldwyn, people don't know what they want until you give it to them." "You see that? You just did it again. Wisecracks. I told you there's no money in wisecracks. People want a happy ending." "I know this will come as a shock to you, Mr. Goldwyn, but in all history, which has held billions and billions of human beings, not a single one ever had a happy ending." Dorothy left the room. "Does anybody in here know what the hell that woman is talking about?" In 1937, Scott Fitzgerald came to Hollywood, triggering Dorothy's guilt about abandoning her fiction writing. Since he was an alcoholic like herself, she felt compassion for him, but she also despised in him the very quality she hated in herself, sniveling self-pity, the way they both wasted their talent and their lack of self-discipline. Dorothy claimed to have slept with him at some point, but that was neither here nor there. In 1937, Dorothy sought to lure Scott into the Communist Party by inviting him to social gatherings that doubled as political functions. That summer, Hemingway came to town with his documentary film, The Spanish Earth, and Dorothy made sure that Scott was invited to the private benefit screening. The three had lunch together with Benchley on the day of, and soon after that, Dorothy's interest in Scott's political education came to an end. Being social without politics, Dorothy invited him to a dinner dance put on by the Screenwriters Guild. When Scott was alone at the table, he noticed a pretty blonde nearby and began to cast admiring glances in her direction. This was Sheila Graham, his future romance. Dorothy and Alan soon met Hemingway's current romance, Martha Gellhorn, on their crossing to Europe. The Campbells went to Paris and spent 10 days in Spain, some of it with Gellhorn and Hemingway. Spain had been under siege for almost a year. Shops in Madrid kept their doors open in spite of the crackle of machine gun fire in the background. The Campbells also stayed in Valencia while under nighttime air raids. Terror was written on everyone's faces, especially the children's. Back in Hollywood, many in the film industry regarded Alan as an illegitimate writer riding on his famous wife's coattails, but they couldn't have been further from the truth. Dorothy lacked the focus that Alan had, a focus required to crank out scripts. In 1940, after another miscarriage, Dorothy's doctor found the presence of uterine fibroid tumors which prevented her from carrying a baby to term. She needed a hysterectomy at once. After recovery, she and Alan attended a party in North Hollywood with Scott Fitzgerald. As their mood grew nostalgic, they sang "The Last Time I Saw Paris." A week later, Scott fell dead of a heart attack while browsing through the Princeton Alumni Weekly and eating a Hershey bar. His body was placed in the William Wordsworth Room at Pierce Brothers Mortuaries. Dorothy and Alan were among the few people in attendance. Jay Gatsby's funeral came to mind. "The poor son of a bitch," Dorothy said softly. So few people had read Gatsby that by the time her remark made its way around Hollywood, people thought it was some pithy eulogy she delivered over the coffin. It's around this time that more cracks started showing in Dorothy and Alan's marriage. Dorothy began to scapegoat Alan for their failure to conceive a child. She made scathing comments that he was gay, even to his mother's face. She found his mannerisms irritating. The more Dorothy relied on Alan, the more bitterly she resented him. Alan began to assert himself. His confidence shot up when he got a string of assignments from RKO with a salary of $1,250 a week by himself. Not to be outdone, Dorothy was still getting jobs too. She wrote for the Hitchcock film Saboteur. A small cameo was planned, but it is not in the final cut. In spite of these minor successes, the Campbells' marriage was on the rocks. Alan increased his drinking. Friends avoided them. Then Dorothy got a crazy idea that Alan sign up for World War II, thinking it would please her. He signed up. Dorothy was not pleased. They were a pair of vipers. While Alan was in officer candidate school in Florida in January 1943, Alec Woolcott died of a heart attack and cerebral hemorrhage. Dorothy returned to New York and joined the Round Tablers in the Rose Room for one last drink. The Kaufmans, Nisa McMean, Peggy Leach, and several other ghosts were in attendance. Harpo Marx recalled that it was our strangest gathering. In 1945, Benchley was dead, also from a cerebral hemorrhage complicated by cirrhosis of the liver. Dorothy was in shock. When visitors of the Algonquin would ask Frank Case what became of the Round Table, he'd shrug and say, "What became of the reservoir at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street? These things do not last forever." In 1919, young and unproved, their goal had been to have it all: love, money, fame, and happiness. 25 years later, they were still looking for happiness and wondered why fame had failed to satisfy. Mortality never seemed so close. The Round Table was self-destructing. Ring Lardner, suffering from TB and alcoholism, died of a heart attack at age 48. Ruth Hale died suddenly at 47. Brune followed at 51. Woolcott had engorged himself with food and was dead at 56, the same age as Bob Benchley. Bob, Scott Fitzgerald had told him after going on the wagon, "Don't you know that drinking is slow death?" "So, who's in a hurry?" retorted Benchley. When Alan was sent overseas, Dorothy spent time with playwright Lillian Hellman, whose partner, Dashiell Hammett, was overseas too. After the war, Alan sent Dorothy a letter saying that he had fallen in love with a married woman who had 3 children. This relationship never panned out, but the writing was on the wall. They divorced and sold the farm. A fellow officer of Alan's in candidate school, Rosser Lynn Evans, 31, filled the void in Dorothy's life. He was an extremely heavy drinker. Ross and Dorothy wrote a short story together, The Game. It was not good, but Dorothy's screenwriting was still sharp. A film she worked on, called Smash Up, was nominated for an Academy Award. She tried her hand at another play, this one about Mary Lamb, a writer from the 18th century who murdered her mother with a kitchen knife. It was put on by a repertory company in Dallas for 3 weeks to favorable reviews, but the play would not reach Broadway. After a 3-year hiatus from Alan, Dorothy remarried him in 1950 in a Hollywood wedding. To this change of heart, Dorothy said, "What are you going to do when you love the son of a bitch?" Alan was shaky about their future together. A year later, Dorothy's communist activity caught up with her. 2 men rang the doorbell, FBI agents. She had been named by Martin Berkeley, an ex-communist screenwriter who appeared as a cooperative witness before the House of Un-American Activities. Altogether, he named 158 individuals he claimed had been party members in the 1930s, including 5 prominent writers. This accusation destroyed Dorothy's career in the 1950s. In 1955, she was called to the witness stand before the New York State Legislative Committee, which was investigating the alleged diversion of millions in charitable donations to the Communist Party. Dorothy, uncharacteristically, answered politely. Where had the money gone from her fundraising appearances? She genuinely did not know. She thought it was going to people caught in the crossfire in Spain. When asked point blank if she was a party member, she pled the Fifth. The FBI closed its investigation and let her go. Dashiell Hammett was not so lucky. He was imprisoned in a West Virginia federal penitentiary. It wasn't long before Alan walked out and Dorothy moved back to New York, where she felt good to be back. "I get up every morning and want to kiss the pavement," she'd said. She leased a residence in the Volney, a hotel on East 74th Street, where she set to work writing a play with the Volney as the setting. The Ladies of the Corridor premiered in 1953 to a cold reception. Dorothy gave up on Broadway fame and wrote book reviews for Esquire, in addition to submitting a short story, The Bolt Behind the Blue, which she polished while trapped at the writers' colony, Yaddo, in Saratoga Springs. Sometimes Dorothy would struggle to hit deadlines or purposely withhold her column in hopes of someone from Esquire rushing out to grab it from her. The editor, Arnold Gingrich, called the monthly task of procuring Dorothy's writing high forceps delivery. In 1958, the National Institute of Arts and Letters awarded Dorothy the Marjorie Peabody Waite Award for Achievement. At the induction ceremony, she was drunk. When called upon to receive the award, she stood up and yelled, "I never thought I'd make it," and then hurriedly sat back down. Halfway through the ceremony, on the verge of passing out, someone rustled her awake. She yelled again, "I never thought I'd make it." In 1961, Alan Campbell was offered a job at 20th Century Fox on condition that he bring Dorothy. The assignment was an adaptation of a French stage play intended as a vehicle for Marilyn Monroe. Dorothy had met Marilyn at the induction ceremony. Dorothy agreed to the job and reluctantly agreed to live with Alan again, this time in a bungalow on Norma Place in West Hollywood after 10 years apart, as it would have been foolish to rent a hotel. The film's title was to be The Good Soup. Fox had contracted Marilyn for 2 films. The first was Something's Got to Give, but due to her emotional disintegration, she was frequently absent from the set. Fox fired her in June 1962. The question of whether to bring her back for The Good Soup became irrelevant. Marilyn died in August. Dorothy and Alan became short on cash to the point Alan was loading up his Jaguar with books Dorothy had reviewed for Esquire and selling them to local bookstores. But then a friend, Parker Ladd, the West Coast editor for Scribner's, conspired with Frederick Schroyer, a professor at California State College, to get Dorothy to join the English department there as a teacher. Ladd and Schroyer enlisted Alan to help convince her. For $20,000, Dorothy agreed. She was to teach American and British literature at Cal State. Schroyer promised that it would be a privilege and an inspiration for the students to hear about the writers she had known personally. Schroyer was wrong. Dorothy's students were there for 3 credits and did not care about literature. Few of them even knew who she was. When she assigned Grapes of Wrath, some of them called it obscene. One student said her mother didn't want the book in the house. When she assigned Sister Carrie, Dorothy found herself in the ridiculous position of having to defend not only Dreiser, but adultery in literature. Only 3 of the 72 students were able to piece together a decent sentence. In the class's defense, Dorothy ran out of things to say after 10 minutes and missed a third of the semester. Schroyer expected Alan to help Dorothy, but he was addicted to barbiturates and hammered most of the time. Dorothy was not above needling Alan, aiming straight for the jugular by calling him worthless. To escape the abuse, Alan removed the door to his bedroom and replaced it with a trick bookcase so that the door could only be opened by a secret catch. Nearing the end of the semester, Dorothy spouted off to the LA Times that her students were the stupidest people on the face of the earth. She described them as humorless, crass, illiterate prigs who only wanted a college education so they could make lots of money. She did, however, acknowledge the fault was probably hers. The next day, she arrived at the classroom to discover some of her students read newspapers and did not appreciate her remarks. On the blackboard, they had listed every allegation they could dig up regarding her allegiance to the Communist Party. One day in June, after coming home from the hairdresser, Dorothy called out to Alan through the bookshelf to his room, but there was no answer. When she had last seen him, he was carrying his bag of dry cleaning, saying that he planned to lie down for a while. Dorothy searched for the catch on his bookshelf and, after much difficulty, stepped into the room. Alan was curled up on the bed with a cigarette clenched between his fingers and the plastic dry-cleaning bag draped around his neck and shoulders. When Dorothy went to rattle him awake, she noticed the floor was sprinkled with Seconal capsules. His body felt strange. Rigor mortis had set in. Alan was dead of an overdose at age 59. She was so angry and distraught that when a friend of Alan's asked how she could be of help, Dorothy replied, "Get me a new husband." Dorothy drank in isolation and began smoking 3 packs of Chesterfields a day. She was hospitalized for a broken shoulder during the weekend of Kennedy's assassination. As she improved, she planned her escape. She had a yard sale and sold the house. In New York, she lived back at the Volney and was in and out of hospital due to her drunken falls. Her broken shoulder was still mending. She developed bursitis in the other shoulder. She had shrunk to 80 pounds and couldn't see without her glasses. The moral support of Sarah Murphy and B. Stewart helped her through. In 1965, Dorothy began to bounce back and sent the nurse packing. She gave interviews to Ladies' Home Journal and met friends at the Algonquin, her first time there in 20 years. While waiting in the lobby, seated in an armchair facing the Rose Room, she quickly drew the attention of hotel management. The manager asked why she made so many derogatory comments about the hotel. Dorothy smiled. She said she liked the Algonquin, but it's difficult to get terribly interested in food I digested 45 years ago. On June 7, 1967, B. Stewart's telephone rang. It was the desk clerk at the Volney. "She's gone," announced the clerk. A chambermaid discovered the body. Dorothy was dead of a heart attack at age 73. Her entire estate, worth $20,000 at the time, was given to Martin Luther King Jr. Lillian Hellman, the executor of the will, made the funeral arrangements at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel in New York and had Dorothy's wake. Bill Drost, Dorothy's nephew in Rochester, read about her death in the paper and wrote Lillian Hellman to find out where Dorothy was buried. He received no response. He had his attorney write Hellman. Again, no answer. Dorothy was cremated at Ferncliff Crematory in Hartsdale, New York. During the following weeks, her ashes remained unclaimed. Hellman had left no instructions about their disposition and was upset about not being included in the will. A month later, Ferncliff received word to mail the remains to the legal firm of O'Dwyer and Bernstein at 99 Wall Street, New York City. Paul O'Dwyer waited for further instruction, and kept waiting. Dorothy's ashes remained in the drawer of his filing cabinet until 1988. After the death of Martin Luther King, Dorothy's estate, according to her will, had passed to the NAACP. They took possession of the ashes and designed a memorial garden for Dorothy in Baltimore. In 2020, when the NAACP's Baltimore office relocated, Dorothy's ashes were buried at Woodlawn Cemetery next to her parents in the family plot, thanks to the effort of Kevin Fitzpatrick and the Dorothy Parker Society. A gravestone was unveiled in 2021. The epitaph reads, "Leave for her a red young rose. Go your way and save your pity. She is happy, for she knows that her dust is very pretty."